The notion that the three-act structure has only a recent history and was invented by Hollywood is a myth. Even the highly esteemed New Yorker magazine, in its 2003 article profiling legendary screenwriting teacher Robert McKee, states, woefully incorrectly, that Syd Field, who published the best-selling screenwriting manual Screenplay, invented the three-act structure in 1979. I love you, New Yorker, but you're not even close. It comes from theater, which is, of course, an ancient art form around the world. Where there were people, there was theater. But cinema's history as an art form only starts around 1895. Almost every dramatic element that we take for granted in a movie has its origins in the work of a playwright. Aristotle's Poetics, written in ancient Greece, is often taken as a definitive book, a kind of holy Bible on playwriting. But for Aristotle, it was never meant as a playwriting how-to manual. It was a philosophical response to Plato's insistence in his book, The Republic, that in a perfect society, theater would be unnecessary. Plato said that the first thing we need to do in order to have an ideal republic is get rid of all the playwrights, which he calls tragic poets, because he was talking about Greek tragedies, which were written in verse. In the Poetics, Aristotle is countering Plato by saying that theater serves an important social purpose and should remain a vital part of any republic. And secondly, he's saying, I've seen the finest plays ever written here in ancient Greece, and girl, let me tell you, the best ones have the following things in common. Jumping ahead to ancient Rome, we get the writer Horace, whose book Ars Poetica, or The Art of Poetry, referring to tragic plays, declared the five-act structure to be the only legitimate form of theater. His book also insisted that a play must take place in one location and happen in the course of a single day. These rules didn't start to change until the Romantic period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries with European playwrights like Frenchman René Pixercourt and German August von Kotzebue, who are credited with creating the melodrama, which early silent film picked up and ran with. Normally in an opera, every word is sung. Even the dialogue is written in verse and sung, with a full orchestra punctuating the characters' emotional states. A melodrama was a spoken word opera. We keep the music score, but the actors speak their lines rather than singing them. Sounds a lot like a movie, doesn't it? Think about it. Most big-budget movies around the world today are still, underneath, melodramas. Spoken word operas with a killer music score that heightens the emotional intensity. All of these 19th century playwrights were still using the ancient five-act structure. It's what the audience expected. If it didn't have a five-act structure, it didn't count as a serious play. Jumping ahead a few decades, 19th century French playwright Eugene Scribe gave us what came to be known as the well-made play. The well-made play looks an awful lot to us like a screenplay in its plot structure. His plays involved complicated, fast-paced plots, lots of cliffhangers, and a strong cause and effect structure that builds to a climax and a happy ending. Later, 19th century playwrights like George Bernard Shaw and Norwegian playwright and mutton chop king Henrik Ibsen applied Scribe's concept of the well-made play to their own works, but they fused it with social commentary. Also in this era, a playwriting book called Technique of the Drama, written by German novelist and playwright Gustav Freytag, was published in 1863. Some of the terms we still use in screenwriting were first published in this book, yet so many people still attribute them to Aristotle. Freytag's book also included a picture of a triangle that was a graphic representation of the ideal plot structure. You've seen the triangle somewhere in your life. Maybe your high school English teacher drew it on a whiteboard and broke it down for you. They might have even mistakenly called it an Aristotle triangle, and it was still five-act structure, but not for much longer. Enter French playwright Victorien Sardou. Sardou was an innovator and was always open to experimentation on stage and even gimmicks to boost ticket sales. In 1897, he incorporated spiritualism and live seances into his shows, much to the chagrin of the Catholic Church, which attacked him as a charlatan and a heretic. Something else he tried was to shorten the number of intermissions in a typical 5-act play. He thought, "We live in fast times here in late 19th century Paris, and all of these annoying intermissions are getting tedious. It interrupts the story, and it makes the evening interminably long for the audience." So he tried an experiment. He said, "I think the audience can sit through 2 acts, then an intermission, then 2 more acts, then an intermission, then the final act." Shockingly, he therefore had the curtain of his well-made 5-act plays go up and down fewer times, marking the first presentation of something that looked like a 3-act play on stage. In other words, Acts 1 and 2, curtain, Acts 3 and 4, curtain, and then Act 5. Sardou died in 1908, just as movies were often running. In 1936, a playwriting how-to book called Theory and Technique of Playwriting by an American named John Lawson was published. Lawson talks about cycles of action. For example, the protagonist's decision at the midpoint of Act 1, about 15 to 18 minutes in, to follow a certain course of action. Think of this as a medium-sized plot twist, a small cliffhanger right in the middle of Act 1. In 5-act terms, that is the end of Act 1. Although today, we think of it as the middle of Act 1 when looking at it through a 3-act lens. Then, tension develops in fulfilling that decision, and a new complication arises, meaning the major reversal or cliffhanger or plot twist at the end of Act 1. That is one cycle. In 5-act terms, he's describing Acts 1 and 2. In 3-act terms, it's now just Act 1. And guess how many times the cycle repeats? 2 more times. 3 parts. But he's still not saying the magic words 3-act structure yet. 3 years later, finally, in 1939, we get the how-to manual Write That Play, published by American theater scholar and professor Kenneth Rowe. In his book, Rowe finally mentions the 3-act structure in print as the dominant form for playwrights. Notice that he doesn't say it's the best form or the highest form or any such kind of ethnocentric language. Does every culture use a 5-act structure that they like to trace back to ancient Greece? Of course not. But he correctly describes it as the most standard or dominant structure for a stage play. Further down, he mentions that it can be applied to motion pictures. 10 years later, Lawson would revise his 1936 book in 1949 and change the title to Theory and Technique of Playwriting and Screenwriting, making it the first book to equate screenwriting with playwriting as a serious literary pursuit. The 3-act play structure had become the dominant form because it had spread around the world due to colonialism and cross-pollination among theater artists long before the invention of motion pictures, who smashed into each other through the power of European empire building. For instance, when the British East India Company came into India in the early 1600s for trade and commerce initially, they brought with them not only the Western way of managing land, collecting taxes, quartering armies, and fighting wars, they brought with them arts and entertainment for British soldiers who were stationed there, and for the British civilian administrators and their families who settled there. When the running of India was taken from the East India Company by Queen Victoria and the British government in 1858, they made their capital city Calcutta, today known as Kolkata. Thousands more British civilians took up residence in Calcutta as either government employees or private entrepreneurs. Calcutta was, over time, rebuilt in England's image. It came to be called the crown jewel of the British Empire, or the London of the East. With that came British arts and entertainment, including, most importantly for us, 5-act plays. It's not that Indians didn't already have their own theatrical traditions. but as time went on, some of their theatrical traditions commingled. My real point is, it's wrong to state that Hollywood, Syd Field, or Robert McKee invented the three-act structure. But it is also wrong to make the blanket statement that everything related to screenwriting was invented by Aristotle. It owes a huge debt to theater, and there were a whole lot of people in between who pushed it forward around the world, making it the dominant form.